appreciate the opportunity that I have to be here today. Hopefully this microphone is close enough to my face, otherwise I'll be talking from my kid. In the interest of time, a lot of the things that Rad Yeager and Bob Glott and Dan Krug talked about earlier dovetail pretty well with my topic of cotton, water, and fertility management. So I was told when I was growing up playing baseball that it's important that, you know, if you're in the later innings and if you're behind, it's better to be trying to hit singles than trying to hit home runs. So I'll try to hit a single here and also try to hopefully help us catch up a little bit. As has been mentioned, right now we're really seeing the back end of something that's been happening over the last 40 to 50 years, which is that we've been using more water out of the overall aquifer than it's able to recharge. And so the end result of that is that over time water gets more and more difficult to pull out, and we have less water available to us for irrigation. Eventually, these are pictures from the Dust Bowl era. If you look at the amount of rainfall and the issues that we had in 2011, 2012, and even 2013, those were fairly comparable with the effects of the Dust Bowl back in the 1930s. And so really the big difference has been that we've had underground irrigation water that we've been able to pull from. So our goal is that as we try to use our water efficiently, that we use both irrigation level and irrigation timing in such a way that we can maximize our yields, maximize our quality, and still be able to do it under limited water. So that's something that has been, as you've seen, a general trend throughout these meetings today. Some of the challenges that we run into, Bob Glott mentioned this, was that, it's very difficult to say how much water it takes to grow a bale of cotton, because we really don't know, looking forward, how much water we're going to have in the form of rainfall. We don't know what the temperature, weeds, insect situation is going to be. And so a lot of what we do has to be, based off of our past experience here. Now in West Texas, this tends to be less of an issue than it is in other parts of the cotton belt, but you could potentially overwater, but you run into problems with your fertility, it's expensive, you run into oxygen starvation in the roots, and this is Dr. Craig Bednarz standing in some cotton that's been overwatered when we're in Georgia. Craig is about 6 feet tall, and you can see that the cotton here is about 3 feet over his head. It wasn't his fault, I promise. But the interesting thing is you can actually still see some cotton bolls on here. So if you have too much water, it also changes the pattern of growth that you have with your cotton plant. It's going to require you to increase your PGR applications, or in West Texas, use PGR applications. It's going to increase your internode length. It's going to decrease your fruit retention, especially at the bottom of the plant. And it's really going to make for a lot of inefficiency within the system that we're trying to grow it here. One of the other issues, and this was touched on by Bob as well, is that a lot of our efficiency is going to be based on how we apply the water to the field. If you have just a general low pressure overhead sprinkler system, your efficiency is going to be between about 50 and maybe 75% on the high end as far as efficiency. You can increase that using LEPA or LISA up to 80 to 90%. But really, with the existing technology so far, what we've seen, the highest water efficiency that you can get is with drip irrigation. The advantage to drip irrigation is that you can put the water right in the root zone, and you don't have a lot of loss through the bottom of the profile. You have almost no loss through the top of the profile. And so you're able to exceed 90% efficiency and even approach 100% efficiency. When we were in Georgia, we did work with drip irrigation, and it was kind of a guessing game whether it would ever pay off for itself, because the reality was we had adequate water and we were able to maintain good yields with drip irrigation, but we didn't see this big yield boost. When we came to West Texas, it immediately was able to pay for itself because we were able to increase our yields by about 20 to 25% just based on the increased irrigation efficiency and therefore the amount of effective water that we had in our root zones here. You've seen these with Dr. Krieg, with Bob Glott. The total amount of water that the cotton crop uses during different portions of the growing season here. Depending on where you're at, estimates go up to 2,500 up to 3/10 to 3,500 of an inch a day at the peak water use here. One of the questions, though, that came up, especially as we were talking about corn and grain sorghum today, was if we had to choose, and if we have a limited amount of water that we're going to be able to use over the growing season, which portion of the growing season is going to be most affected by a decrease in irrigation? So the main growth stages of cotton that I'm going to break it down into real quick here are, first of all, germination. Early in the season, you need enough water for stand establishment. Really, once you have the stand established, you're not using a lot of water, and most of the water that you're losing is going to be through evaporation from the soil surface. Early growth, this is really where you start to make the transition from evaporation to transpiration as the main form of water loss in the soil. Then as you get into squaring and flowering, just as we've shown, that's really where you ramp up your water use. It's almost all due to the crop at that point. And like Dr. Krieg mentioned, you run into different aspects of yield limitations in different parts of the squaring and flowering process. During squaring, you limit the size of the plant, you limit the number of fruiting sites that the plant's able to produce, and so you really lock yourself into some yield limitation right off the bat. As you get into flowering, you see a lot with square shedding, and it can be rather dramatic in some cases. And then later in the season, as the bolls start to develop, you see a loss in yield, but you also see a loss in fiber quality, as I'll show you in a second. So there are several guides out there that give estimates of how much water is going to be required at different times of the year. This is fairly similar to what Bob showed, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. I would like to show you one of the studies that we did, and also a study that we've done in conjunction with Jim Brodowski on timing of water stress in cotton. And the question came up, well, which stage is most sensitive to water stress, both from a productivity and from a quality standpoint? Keep in mind, we were stressing these crops pretty good. It was 3 weeks without irrigation for each of these irrigation treatments here. But we had one where we did it starting at first square for 3 weeks, so first square to just after first flower. One right at first flower for 3 weeks, 3 to 6 weeks after first flower, and then we tried one starting at 3 weeks after first flower and then continuing pretty well to the end of the season. We wanted to see what effects that would have on our overall yield here. So, real quick, I'm a teacher in my spare time, so I'll go ahead and ask you all a quiz real quick. Out of these four, which do you think is going to have resulted in the lowest yields? How many of you say the first one? Raise your hand. All right. You okay? Second one, raise your hands. A few more. Third one? Fourth one? All right. see that half the class didn't answer, which is pretty typical for most classes as well. With this first square treatment here, we saw severe stunting, we saw a limited number of bolls on the plants, and we lost about 25% of our yield. These pictures were taken in 2011, so keep in mind that in 2011, having 5 bolls on the plant only lost us about 25% of our yield, just because of the limitations that we had due to the hot temperatures. With our first flower treatment, and I have to make a caveat on this, we saw dramatic yield losses here, and a lot of it was that we had treated the crop pretty well up to that point, and we just stressed it to death over those 3 weeks. So we saw huge losses in yield. It was mostly due to just a ton of shedding right here at the top of the plant. That could vary from year to year, where that's going to be a lot less dramatic. Later in the season, we saw about 20 to 35% yield loss in our later irrigation stress treatments here. And then, just for comparison, this is one of our full irrigation treatment plants here. So, you know, our top end yields in this case were only about 1,500 pounds per acre on this study. But what we saw in this case, and it was consistent over the 2 years that we did the study, which also tended to be very dry years, was that our early flower stress really hammered our crop here. And even more so than that is if you stress your crop late in the season, and by late in the season I mean after your flowers are formed, you really suffer with your fiber quality. What we found was that even though we lost yield with our early season stress, our fiber quality maintained itself pretty well. It showed a lot of the maturity characteristics, the fiber length, upper quartile length, fineness that you would expect from irrigated cotton. Even though we didn't see a lot of loss here late in the season yield, we tended to see a lot of drop-off here on, for instance, our fiber length per number, our fineness, our maturity ratio. All of these suffered, and so you need to keep in mind with cotton that as you cut off water late in the season, you're going to be paying for it in your fiber quality as well. We also saw a lot of difference in the actual production on the nodes of the plant here. So, like I mentioned, Bob and Dan talked a lot about really trying to dial into the amount of irrigation that we do based on the time of the year, your potential evapotranspiration. The last thing I'd like to cover, and again, this won't be a long thing, but I'd like to point out a couple of highlights from it, is in fertility management. If you look at the total amount of nutrients the cotton plant takes up, the real big ones that it takes up are going to be nitrogen, potassium, and calcium. In fairness, the ones that we really need to focus on, you know, from a fertilizer standpoint, are really nitrogen and phosphorus in this area for the macronutrients. But with nitrogen, it's interesting. When I was in Georgia on really sandy soils, we put out about 130, maybe a little bit more pounds per acre of nitrogen. Here in West Texas, typically we're closer to 80 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Your cotton leaves are about 5 to 6% nitrogen during the active growing period of the season. As you get later into the growth cycle, most of that nitrogen is actually cannibalized by the plant, and it's going to be shipped into the developing fruit. And so by the time you get to the foliation, the bulk of the nitrogen has already been removed from the leaves at that point and is in the bolls. But cottonseed is about 6% nitrogen by weight, and if you figure a typical 60% seed, 40% lint. A 2,000 pound yield is going to require 72 pounds of nitrogen just for the cotton seed. And so if you're looking for high yields, you've got to be, up above 80 pounds to the acre just to be able to maintain that. Obviously, a lot of that's going to come down to your soil tests. It's going to come down to your in-season measurements to verify where you are with it. It's important, just like we talked with corn and with sorghum, don't put it all in one shot if you can help it. Nitrogen's very mobile. You don't need a ton of vegetative growth up front, and if you put on too much nitrogen, you'll actually start to shed some of your fruit.